Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, AFA's Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and I'd like to welcome you to the next event in our Aerospace Nation speaker series. We're really pleased this afternoon that the Honorable Matt Donovan could join us today. Mr. Donovan is the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, and in that position, he's a principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense for force readiness, force management, and other personnel matters, policy, and guidance. Prior to his current position, Mr. Donovan served as the Undersecretary of the Air Force and as the Acting Secretary of the Air Force. Prior to that, he was the Policy Director on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he's a fighter pilot extraordinaire, retiring from the Air Force as a colonel with over 2,900 hours in the mighty F-15 Eagle, and the F-5 as an aggressor pilot. So Matt, welcome, and thanks very much for joining us today. Before we start our conversation, what I'd like to do is give you the microphone for some opening remarks to set the stage for today's discussion. So over to you.
Well, thanks, Dave. It's great to be back with the Mitchell Institute, and I've spent a lot of time with you actually in person at the Mitchell Institute, so this is something a little bit new for us, but I've been following you online, and it seems to be a great venue for getting the word out from senior leaders, both in the Air Force, DOD, and so forth. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage on where we are right now. I was performing the duties of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel Readiness starting on the 28th of December. And then on March 2nd, when my nomination went forward, in accordance with the Vacancy Act rules, I had to step out of the position. And then about 3 weeks later, I was confirmed. And when I came back in as the confirmed Undersecretary of Defense, the whole world had changed. Every aspect of American society was impacted by the COVID-19 global pandemic, and then of course our response to it. So, but one of the things that I wanted to get across to you is that while we're providing a robust response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we're still have our eyeball on the horizon and looking out for the things that we would normally be doing in personnel and readiness and as a Department of Defense. So with that, I'm glad to be here and ready to take your questions.
Well, Matt, thanks very much for those comments, and particularly for your leadership taking the department through this COVID-19 crisis. We all agree that in many ways, the pandemic has changed the strategic context in which our military has to operate, but the national defense strategy remains constant. That said, would you speak to some of the ways that the services are continuing to conduct training and operations while at the same time mitigating the risk of the viral transmission?
Well, certainly, and Secretary Esper laid out his priorities for our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the first is to make sure that we take care of the health and safety of our service members, the DOD civilian in our workforce, and their families as well. Secondly was to make sure that we maintain the readiness to respond to any threat as we would normally do in our national security role. And then lastly is to provide a robust response in support of the whole of nation effort against the global pandemic. So that has been sort of ruling the way we've been going about business over the past couple of months, and that's important. Now, one of the things that we're looking at are some of the impacts of the COVID-19 when it comes to readiness. But we've also prioritized the missions within the national security role that we have as well too. So for example, the strategic capabilities that we have with the nuclear triad, homeland defense, and so forth, with some of our strategic capabilities with the different services as well too. So we're making sure that those have been prioritized, those crews, those capabilities are protected all along through this thing. Now, we haven't seen impacts to readiness directly yet, although anecdotally we know that that there is some impacts to readiness. For example, we've had some high-level Joint Chief of Staff exercises that have been canceled or postponed with some overseas partners. And then, of course, depending on the locations of hotspots of certain areas, first was Italy was one of the first ones we had. You know, there has been some reduction in some activities at that point. So, but we're prioritizing according to the secretary, which is to make sure the health and safety of all our people comes first. So.
Well, what's the department's plan, if there's any overarching plan, to accelerate a return to a new kind of normal in terms of operations? I mean, I understand the disparity amongst the different locations that military units operate around the world, so it's most likely going to be localized. But any insights in that regard?
Well, one of the things that as we learn more about the virus and the overall national response to it is that I think we've settled on the fact that we're probably going to have some kind of constraints until there's a widely available vaccine. And we think that some of the social distancing practices, some of the foundational basic hygiene practices that we've emphasized and in place will probably be with us for a while. And I think the services are adjusting very well to that. You know, there was a couple of weeks ago, there was a graduation down at Air Force Basic Training where all the graduates and the new basic trainees that were just graduating were standing in formation with masks on. And so I think, you know, we're a very resilient Department of Defense, and we'll make it work at the same time as complying with the Secretary's priorities for us.
Well, thanks for those insights, but we don't want to spend all our time on COVID-19. Although on a related issue, I think everyone's anticipating a steep decline in defense budgets faced with the COVID response stimulus packages. And all the services are struggling to reshape for pure competition, but none are so strained as the Air Force, which has deferred any meaningful recapitalization for 30 years. Yet personnel costs take up the largest single category cost. Air Force personnel costs exceed Air Force procurement dollars by nearly $10 billion. So what's the forecast for the cost of the workforce? Is it still going upward? What are some of the factors that are involved, and can growth factors be mitigated?
Well, starting from your first point on you know, the response to COVID-19, when you think about it, we had a national deficit of $22 trillion, and over the course of about a 6-week period, we increased that deficit to $25 trillion. So I think that anyone who thinks that we're going to continue in an upward climb in the defense budget is probably without merit. And we saw that the flat line of the budget at zero real growth coming into this. And I think if we could keep zero real growth over the next FYDP, we'd be very happy with that. To your point on cost of personnel, you know, in 2024, it will be 50 years since we started the all-volunteer force. And all-volunteer forces, as we've discovered, are expensive. You know, we've got to pay people because we have to attract the right people, and then we have to retain them. And especially when you have a robust economy on the outside, then we're competing for the same pool of talent that people on the outside are. So understanding that, personnel costs also inflate at a much higher rate than all other costs. For example, our personnel costs historically over the past 10 years or so have inflated by 5.8% per year, versus the rest of inflation factors, which inflate at about 1.8 to 2%. So every time you think you're getting ahead on it, it ends up costing you more. So one of the things that we need to look at as a service, as all the services and the department, is to make sure that we have the right numbers of people in the right places because we're likely not going to be able to just keep adding to end strength without taking advantage of technologies and those sort of things to reduce the requirement for the numbers of people that we have. And I know you're a big fan of, you know, Combat Cloud and digital modernization, and that's one of the areas that I'm pushing within the PNR, but also within Department of Defense as well too. If COVID-19 hasn't taught us anything, is that we've got to really get serious about digital modernization so that we can have access to the right data at the right time in order to form leadership decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I'm sure you're well aware that's echoed up and down the chain, and modernization of our uh, information architectures obviously are becoming extraordinarily important. As I might mention too, classification rules and procedures. People can't deal with something as simple as FOUO on some of these networks, or they're being told that. But you know, we'll leave that for another discussion. Prior to the COVID-induced recession, this is on a related subject to people, the department faced some serious challenges competing with the private sector for talent. And while some would suggest that this pressure is likely relieved for a little while, is the department considering personnel management reforms that would make a military career perhaps more attractive to younger generations?
Absolutely. And, you know, the Congress has done some work with the Defense Officer Personnel Management Act, DOPMA, and that sort of thing, but there's still a lot of tinkering around the margins on it. I think our personnel management system is still largely based on our 1950s model, which is, you know, induct a large number of draftees, increase for a wartime commitment, and then de-arm afterwards, which is sort of the militia mindset that Americans have. So, you know, there's still lots of things in there, up and out, up or out policies and those sort of things that I think we need to take a look at. There's also other considerations that young people coming in today have expectations on, and one is the ability to maybe take a pause in a career. One of the things that we have a much higher percentage of women that at some point may want to have a family. And I can talk about that from personal experience with my wife, who got out of the active duty to raise some kids, and then wanted to keep her hand in it, and to go back into active duty once they reach high school age. Well, it takes a literal act of Congress to do that. So one of the things that we're working with the Congress is to apply more permeability, the ability to move between the different components at different times in your life. It may be when you're younger and you want to start a family, and that applies to either males or females, depending on who has their career going at the time. But then also in the later years, lieutenant colonel and colonels who now have parents that may be aging that they need to take care of, and take a little bit of time off, and we need to allow that to occur without any penalty for doing that. And I'm not saying that you would, you know, collect the same seniority and get promoted while you're off on that, but you ought to be able to come in at the same place you left. And, you know, so those are some of the um, issues that we're in really close consultation with Congress on to help us with that. And they're very supportive. They're very supportive. One of the other issues that we'll work on is duty status reform. You know, we have 28 different status types between the reserve components, the guard, the reserve, the active duty, and it's so confusing, and they've sort of been bolted on over the years, is that we're working with the Congress to get that narrowed down and really to get same pay, same entitlements for the same work across the board. So those are just a few of the areas that we're working.
Well, that's awesome. If I can be so bold as to compliment you on pursuing those kinds of changes. And that's kind of a nice segue into this next topic that I wanted to discuss with you, and that's the Defense Officer Personnel Management Act, or DOPMA, as most people are familiar with. For those that aren't, this is legislation from the 1980s that sets the rules for much of officer management. It dictates and constrains so much of your personnel policy. And there have been some rumblings out there about potential receptiveness for reform in this area. Is there any appetite in the department right now to ask for relief from DOPMA? And what would you ideally like to see if such a reform to DOPMA were enacted?
Well, I think it's related to some of those other areas that I mentioned, up or out, where we require people to continue to progress and where they may be happy in a particular place and where they're at. When you compare the United States military to some of our coalition partners, say, and the Germany's, the Dutch,
Right.
those sorts of things. Now, they don't have the same drivers that we have in order to continually rotate forces in order to man overseas positions. And then when they come back, they have to have some place to go. And that's really the driver for our whole PCS process. So that's something that we want to take a look at, but also that ability to take a pause and at no penalty. That's one of the things that DOTMA sort of limits us on as well too. So I think the over on the Hill, I think the appetite is there to help us. We just need to be able to bring to them, the real meaty things that we want to change in there. But they're willing to listen.
One of the hot topics, if you will, that you mentioned earlier were Guard and Reserve. Since the drawdown in the 90s, our reserve components, the Air National Guard and the Air Force Reserves on the Air Force side, has become an operational reserve. This total force has essentially masked the fact that our active duty military is too small to do the jobs that our nation asks of it to do today. How can the department build back into its calculus this essential piece of readiness for prolonged conflict?
Well, you bring up a really good point. When we look back at the years where we were really active and flying airplanes in the military during the 80s, it was the heart of the Cold War. We were in the Reagan buildup years. And in some cases, with the NDS driving us back to great power competition, we can sort of make a comparison between, well, do we need to have that same sort of mindset? And I think the mindset is there, but although great power competition and the threats we face today rhyme with the Cold War, I think there are really some major differences there. One is in the 1980s, we faced really a single superpower, right, in the USSR. Where today we have two peer or near peer competitors with Russia and China. The other is and you've already mentioned this, is we have about half the size of the military that we did in the waning years of the Cold War or the Reagan buildup years, the end of the 80s. So we have twice the threat and half the size of the force. So we need
Yep.
to be smart about how we do this. Now, we have to put that into the context that, are we facing a lower defense budget future, at least in the short term, while we deal with this COVID-19 response and the loss of jobs and the economic stimulus packages that have been going on. So that's sort of the big differences that we really need to worry about, and we have to take advantage of technology wherever we can in order to keep our advantage. That was one of the things that we always talked about back in the 80s when we faced down Mother Russia on the Fulda Gap, right? And they had us outnumbered 10-1. But we weren't worried about it because we knew we had better training, we had better technology, and we had better equipment in order to face the hordes down, if you would.
Yeah, and now that that disparity is growing smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, Mr. Secretary, I know your office has been spending a lot of time standing up the U.S. Space Force. Right now, the Space Force is composed of previous Air Force personnel, actually of current Air Force personnel. But the Army and the Navy also have space assets and personnel. Do you see the department moving toward consolidating space missions and personnel together in the Space Force? And importantly, do you see the manpower dollars following to support any move like this? Also, one more, what needs to be done from a PR perspective to accelerate the full development of the Space Force?
Well, I think there was a lot of impetus behind the Space Force. There was a lot of excitement about it, from hey, this is a new domain, and like the other domains that have services that are dedicated to it, then it made sense at the time, and it still absolutely makes sense. And what we're finding with the Space Force is that when it first stood up, it had a grand total of one member, right? It was General J. Raymond. And then I had a second member when his senior enlisted advisor or command chief, was enlisted into the Space Force. And then with the latest Air Force Academy graduation, I believe it was 86 more commissioned second lieutenants into the Space Force. So I think the excitement is there. I think what we need to do is we need to work with Congress, because they were very leery about standing up more overhead and more bureaucracy with what they perceived as what would come along with the new service. So, we'll work from my perch and PNR with the Air Force to support them as much as we can, the Department of the Air Force, to help show what I always sort of advanced when I was up and still in the Air Force, which is let's take advantage of this opportunity to build a new service in the 21st century mold, and taking care of the information technology and take advantage of the information technology in order to do this, rather than standing up a Space Force staff that looks just like the Army staff and the Air Force staff and those sort of things. So we're in full support of Secretary Barrett and the Department of the Air Force to help where we can with that.
Let's transition for a minute from personnel readiness to force structure readiness. A year and a half ago, in response to poor readiness rates, then Secretary Mattis set a goal of 80% mission capable rates for fighter aircraft. What's the relationship between that 80% MC rate, force readiness, and readiness to support our current operational plans?
I think it's important to understand that mission capable rate is one measure, but it has to be taken in conjunction with all the other measures that go with it. It's aircraft availability and the training of the pilots and the ground support personnel and the maintainers and the availability of the equipment to begin with, the parts supply chain and all those things. So as one measure, I think it had its drawbacks in order to measure readiness. The other thing is when we take a look at mission capable rates or aircraft availability or a lot of those measures, they tend to be historical and they tend to be lagging indicators. What we're trying to do with my Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness is to try to come up with those leading indicators so that we can put some predictive value into this and provide the senior leaders like the secretary, who's really, his role is really the resource allocator in chief, to show him where the resource hose ought to be aimed at, that would give him the most bang for the buck. And so as we take advantage of big data analytics and being able to get information unlocked from, in some cases, very locked stovepipe containers, then I think that will help us be able to make informed decisions as senior leaders on those types of issues.
And you hit on this to a degree, but if aircraft can't fly, then air crews can't train, or they didn't used to be able to train. And there comes a point in time where combat ops take a hit too. So are there some ways, and how do we sustain aircrew readiness when we do face lower aircraft readiness rates for regardless whatever the reason is?
Right. Well, the fidelity of simulators today is incredible. you know, compared to when you and I went over on the F-15 sim when we were captains, and you know, you had no display. Every night, every sortie in the simulator was a night flight, and you know, it just wasn't very high fidelity. And you snap forward to today and go into an F-35 simulator with the, you know, full motion video and very high fidelity instrumentation in it. You know, it's just incredible. In fact, a lot of people don't really know this, but you know, the whole plan for the F-35 is that 50% of their required training would occur in the simulator. For various reasons. One is, you know, we don't always want the adversary to know how we're training for certain things. And the other is that you can get repetition a lot more quickly and at a cheaper rate. And nothing ever replaces flying hours, you know, and I'm not advocating that at all. But we need to take advantage of that. And not only the simulator fidelity, but being able to connect them all together in the network so that we, you know, we can practice those large scale fights in the way that we would actually go to war. It's pretty amazing the technology they have to be able to do that. But that's one way of doing it.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking as you're answering that question, it would be nice to be able to get folks who are interested in this area but have never been exposed to see just how great the fidelity is in modern simulators between what we can do today. And like you said, every time you climbed into that sim and you put the lid down, you have no visual cues whatsoever. You're just purely flying IFR instrument flying rules inside the cockpit.
Right.
Now, there's a balance between continuing to sustain old aircraft and taking risk by retiring faltering fleets with no replacements for decades. I think a good example is the B-1. Its low mission capable rates that were the result of high demand for a very small fleet in the Middle East. Yet this overuse is emblematic of low density, high demand assets. In other words, procurement quantities directly impact long-term readiness. Do you see these lessons resonating inside the department?
I think so. And one of the things that, you know, even before this COVID pandemic hit, I mean, you know, one of the things that we've been trying to do is realign, both in my previous perch in the Air Force and now in the personnel readiness world, is realign the department to the National Defense Strategy imperatives. And one of those is always having to balance, you know, the iron triangle of force structure, modernization, and readiness. You know, we always have to be ready to fight tonight with what we have, but we always need to have that eye on the future of how we're going to be able to modernize and improve our capabilities to meet future threats. So it's something that senior leaders always struggle with. And the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary struggle with that as well too. And you know, key is gaining that advocacy over on the Hill,
Right.
because one of the things that we run into are sort of these parochial biases that folks have, and it's not just members on the Hill that have parochial biases. You know, it's folks in OSD, it's OMB, it's in the White House, and so, you know, the big thing is education, understand and gain advocacy for what we're trying to do, and you'll be surprised that you know, a little education goes a long way in explaining not only across the river on the Hill, but even on our own side in the executive branch.
Well, I appreciate that. And as you well know, that's one of the things that we try to do here at the Mitchell Institute is try to get that word out on some of these critical issues. One last question before we move on to our set of observers to ask you some additional questions. The 1970s were a decade characterized as a hollow force. Defense budgets were historically low, as were readiness numbers. I recall when F-15 sat on the ramp without engines and young fighter pilots barely sustained landing currency, much less gaining necessary flight experience. Yet this was also the decade that saw the rise of Red Flag, the development and the procurement of the A-10, the F-15, the F-16, and the B-1A. And all of this set the conditions for Reagan's defense buildup, a force structure that the Air Force is still living off today. So what lessons are there for us from the 70s as we face declining budgets and growing threats? Any observations on this era?
I've thought a lot about this, especially back at the beginning years of the Budget Control Act when we were starting to take some steep cuts into the defense budget, and we were struggling with divesting, legacy airplanes and that sort of thing to try to meet those cuts. And one of the big differences I saw between the 1970s and when we were divesting iron was, you mentioned, walking down the ramp and seeing holes in F-15s that didn't have motors in them, but you had F-15s. So one of the things that I was considering putting forward during those years was Hollow Force as a strategy is not divest things that that you might not be able to upgrade and use in the future. But that was the big difference that I saw. That we had tanks and airplanes and ships that may have been old, but they were still force structure that could have been upgraded at some point, and we ended up doing that. I mean, one of the big pluses of the Reagan era was to get the supply chain back going again, and get the industrial base back cranking up again. Some of the same things that we face today that we need to think about is make sure that we're not just buying the shiny new airplanes or the shiny new tanks or ships. Is we got to make sure that we have an industrial base that's able to support that type of force structure moving forward and be able to respond quickly in an emergency. Some of the things that you're seeing today in the COVID-19 with the Defense Production Act and, having some of these large automakers now making ventilators and that sort of thing, that's sort of related to what we're talking about. If we were into no kidding crisis mode in a shooting conflict, we've got to be able to have an industrial base that can crank up munitions, that can crank up airplanes and parts and those sort of things. So probably a good discussion to have with Ellen Lord on one of your future programs.
Hey, that's a great idea. Appreciate a kind word from you to her. And thanks very much for that response and a great discussion. I think the department and the nation is indeed blessed to have someone of your operational expertise, your expertise on the Hill, and then senior leadership positions inside the department in the position that you're in. It's very, very fortuitous. So the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and the AFA wish you all the best in this era of ever increasing challenges. We're in good hands, at least personnel and readiness are. Now, for those of us out there are watching this, our next Aerospace Nation event is tomorrow, and will feature the commander of Global Strike Command, General Ray, and we hope that you all will join us at that event. Now, Secretary Donovan, we're going to switch gears now and open this session to our audience who've been listening in. So let's go ahead and get started. For those of you who are on the line and have been listening in, please use the computer device to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. And right now, I don't see any raised hands, but I know there are people out there that have questions. Oh, I take that back. Laura, you have got the floor.
Hi, thanks for doing this, sir. So my question, I actually submitted it also in advance, but I wanted to know, could you just clear up what exactly the guidance is DoD-wide on deployments across the force? Is this something that you can help me understand a little bit? I know that the stop movement is still in place, but my understanding is that there are many exceptions to this. Troops are still deploying to Afghanistan and OIR. Ships are still getting underway. So what is your guidance to the force and the troops as far as quarantining ahead of time as far as that goes? Is there an across the board, are there across the board rules for that?
Well, the Secretary Esper signed out the extension on April 20th to the travel restrictions memo and orders that he had in place before that. One of the things that it did was it opened up some of the exemptions in there. One of them is the deploying and redeploying of units that previously were frozen into place. And so those are exempted from the travel movement so that we can keep the operational things flowing. What we have done is we put out a series of force health protection guidance. I actually signed out the first one on the 30th of January that started recognizing the potential for the pandemic and gave guidance to the force. Since that time, we put out 8 supplementals that talk about all kinds of different areas, how installation commanders can go to an increased health protection condition level, or HPCON, as we talk about, and some of the things they need to be concerned about inside and outside of the gate. And the services have really put in to place some of those particular isolation concepts, if you will. One of the issues that we have with the testing that's available today is that it's a diagnostic test. So in other words, it will tell you if you're a positive, and it will tell you if you're a not positive, but it won't tell you if you're a negative. That's just the nature of the testing that we have, and that's across the whole country. So in order to minimize the risk to the lowest possible level of spreading infections, then it has to be used in conjunction with those isolation periods, or as you called it, the quarantine, 14-day quarantine. So the services have been successful in using that, not only for deployments, but for their basic training and sessions training and that sort of thing. The Air Force has had that in place now for about a month and a half down at Lackland. And the last I heard, they've only had 4 positive cases in all that time, with about 600 people moving through. So it works, and we have put that out in the Force Health Protection Guidance, which is available on defense.gov. You can see those in there.
So just to be clear though, so are all units that have been deploying, they're still deploying now. They just have to go through this 14-day quarantine or isolation period ahead of time. Is that correct?
Well, you know, it's up to each service, which is the force provider, to the combatant commanders for where they're deploying to. But generally, they follow the guidance that we put out in the Force Health Protection supplements. That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Michael Gordon, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
Yes, I didn't want to leave you without any questions. Obviously, the COVID pandemic poses a lot of challenges. It's created enormous unemployment, and historically, unemployment, while bad for civilian society, has worked to the advantage of the military in terms of recruiting personnel. Have you studied or thought or projected what the implications of this might be for the military in terms of recruiting personnel, and maybe even adjusting your standards higher? I don't know, assuming you can find a way to recruit and train the people you take in.
Well, that's a really great question, and it has applicability for us because one of the problems that we had, and I think General Goldfein even mentioned about this, was trying to fill the shortfall in pilots that we have, because a lot of them were being drawn out into the outside world and into the commercial airlines. Well, you probably know as well as I do is that's probably not a great time to get out and go to commercial airlines because of their downturn in their business. So you're right. I mean, it does help us, and that's sort of historical that we go through these cycles. If it's a really strong, vibrant economy on the outside, then folks tend to weigh that in their decision whether they're going to stay with us or move on, and they tend to move on more. One of the things that we're looking at is because the services, because of the increased social distancing and the isolation, quarantine requirements, that sort of thing. They've had to drop their intake through basic training and that to a little bit of a lower level, which of course leaves us a gap if people retiring and separating at the same level. But what we've seen is as the services put into effect voluntary extensions on enlistments and voluntary extensions on retirement dates or dates of separation, that's sort of making up for that gap now, because folks are deciding to stay longer because they look on the outside and they go, you know, I've got a pretty good job now, so I want to stay. So it's one of the things that we're tracking, but it seems to be evening out right now. What we really hope is for America to get back to work. And you know, I'm with everybody else. You know, I want to see our streets filled and our restaurants filled and all that thing, and get back to work here. So that's pretty much it.
But are you seeing more interest in the military on the part of potential, you know, volunteers as a result of the crisis, or do you have that kind of data, or is it too soon for that?
I think it's probably a little too soon, but I'll tell you, we really haven't had much problem even since the crisis started on recruiting. The services have now adjusted to virtual online recruiting and processing and that sort of thing. So I know the latest data I saw was the Marines have met 100% of their recruiting requirement. Now, once they get into the pipeline and they have to slow down a little bit because of the social distancing and the other restrictions that we have in, but I probably ask me that in 2 months, I'd probably have better data on what we're seeing from that.
Thank you.
Okay, Oriana.
Hi, sir. Thanks for doing this. I wanted to ask real quick on an initiative that I believe you oversee, which is the Deploy or Out initiative. I know for those who are considered non-deployable, officials began last year at least to immediately begin flagging those who were unable to deploy for 12 consecutive months for some separation consideration. Under the NDS, Secretary Mattis made this a priority, and I'm just curious, where does that stand now given the ongoing coronavirus pandemic? Thanks.
Well, I think hasn't changed. You're right, and Secretary Mattis kicked off this initiative. We'd always had what we call retention standards, and the services have to weigh the value they get with somebody who is non-deployable versus what they can do. Now, the service secretaries still have the waiver authority at their levels in order to do this. So Secretary Mattis drove it as everybody, but he again agreed to leave the waiver level at the service secretary. So when you think about it, some deploy in place, like our ICBM crews or our space operators. Maybe they don't need to have the same deployability ability or physical limitations that if they were going over to carry a rifle in the Middle East. So I think it was good that he allowed those waivers to occur down at the secretary level so they could make the best decisions for their service.
And to your knowledge, that's still ongoing, that they're still reviewing these processes, or is there a halt in deploy or out standards given the coronavirus pandemic?
No, there's no halt in it. I mean, it really has no impact on that. I'm not saying that it never will, depending on what we learn about the virus and its effects on people. So, but at this point, no.
Okay, Tara Kopp.
Hi, thanks for doing this. I wanted to talk more about the recruiting and manpower issue. What sort of planning are you doing right now for the potential that there's a resurgence of coronavirus in fall, winter, there's no virus, and this is, something that lingers for, the impacts could linger, 1 to 2 years. So what is your long-term plans for maintaining all of, the readiness, the personnel levels? And then second, of all the changes that DoD has put in place right now, the social distancing, what else do you think needs to be done to kind of protect the long-term health of the force? Thanks.
Well, as far as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that we think that these constraints are going to be with us until we have a vaccine, where it becomes more like smallpox or polio was, where once you got the vaccine and you got the majority of the population vaccinated, then it just, kind of fades into that background. So I think we will have these constraints but I tell you, the services have all been very resilient with this, and they immediately have put these social distancing, isolation plans that are built into whether it's for deployment or whether it's for basic training or those kind of things. So, is there going to be impact? Yes, but I think that they're completely manageable. As far as your second question on what we're doing about it, it's really interesting. We have a full bore effort into helping develop a vaccine in conjunction with HHS. As you probably know, the Defense Health Agency falls under PNR, and we have a Dr. Sean Biggerstaff now, who's the single DoD point of contact for all research and development, and he's been given the task to accelerate as much as possible the development of a vaccine, also development of therapeutics, medicines that could treat folks that were infected, and then also developing testing. As I told you, the limitations that we have on the testing right now really aren't a screening device. They're more of a diagnostic device, which is why we have to do them in conjunction with isolations in order to reduce the risk to the minimum level. So we're pretty excited about it. Not only vaccines, but short-term immediate protection type things that they're working on, whether it's with antigens, antibodies, and all that. So we're dialed in right with the overall Health and Human Services effort with the National COVID Task Force, and I think we're pretty excited that we're going to be able to get to something to at least protect the members of the department at the same time as contributing to the overall national effort.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you project that all of the services will hit their manpower goals, the recruiting goals for this fiscal year? Do you think that some of these impacts, if there's going to be reduced numbers, maybe you don't see it until next year, or because of the economy, everybody's going to hit their goals?
No, I think because of the efforts put in place, the original travel restrictions that sort of clamped down, the services had to pause, figure out how they're going to do the throughput. I think, though, in reality, we're probably going to be somewhat short of the end strength goals. That's why the services have been trying to emphasize the voluntary enlistments or voluntary enlistment extensions and voluntary delay of retirements and separations and that sort of thing. But I think in the end, we'll probably fall somewhat short. But there'll be mitigations in place to take care of that.
And just one last, granted, it's a novel coronavirus, but it seemed like some of these policies were kind of created on the fly. Maybe that's just perspective from the outside. Was there a personnel pandemic policy on the shelf that you guys referred to try and figure out your response, or did you really have to just kind of invent new?
Oh, no. I mean, we've had a global pandemic operations plan on the shelf, really, I would say 15 years or so. It was the Ebola issue, and then there was the H1N1 flu that was in the early 2010s. So no, we've had this global pandemic plan on the shelf, including the Defense Support to Civil Authority that you see, with the NORTHCOM commander being the DoD lead coordinator for the national response. So,
were some of the details new, like the idea that you had to wear masks and that everybody has to wear masks? Was that specific to this virus?
No, matter of fact, we have a stockpile that we've been, drawing on for personal protective equipment that includes masks and that sort of thing. So there was a plan.
Okay, thanks, Tara. let me offer the entire group one more chance to ask a question. I want to be attentive to the time demands on Secretary Donovan, but if there's anybody out there that's got something else they'd like to ask, speak up or forever hold your peace. All right. Well, again, Mr. Secretary, we really appreciate you taking the time. You've got a huge schedule and lots of demands. And so we wish you again all the best. And thanks again. Have a great aerospace power kind of day.
Well, thank you, Dave. I appreciate it. Like I said at the beginning, it's great to be back with the Mitchell Institute, and I know a lot of the usual suspects that are on the other side of the screen that I don't see right now. So howdy to all of them, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Very good. Best of luck.